everyone, and welcome back to Creation Myths. Today, I am going to point out the most important part of a response to one of my videos from Discovery Institute Center for Science and Culture resident biologist and fellow, Dr. Jonnathan Mclatchie, whose doctoral dissertation I still have not read because it's not available electronically, which is weird, and I'd like to point out that that is weird. Dr. Mclatchie, if you see this, email me your dissertation. I want to read it. Anyway, back in January of 2026, I put out this video right here. Refute irreducible complexity with evolution you can see, as a quick introduction to several examples of irreducibly complex traits evolving, directly refuting a major creationist talking point. Early in February 2026, like a week or two after I put out that video, Dr. Mclatchie published this article in response, Irreducible Complexity, a Reply and Challenge to Daniel Stern Cardinal, challenge, in which he took issue with my argument, which was a truly shocking turn of events. I can't believe a creationist, although he might just call himself an intelligent design proponent, whatever, it's the same thing, which a creationist would take issue with my anti-creationist arguments. Now, I am not going to go through most of this article because I am not interested in playing irreducible complexity whack-a-mole, which is what this kind of thing always devolves into. It's a favorite game of many creationists. Mclatchie takes various issues with the examples of the directly observed evolution of irreducibly complex traits that I provided. He gets quite a bit wrong in the process, but I'm not going to go through this entire article word for word. That would take too long, and instead I want to focus on a very narrow point regarding the very last thing I brought up in the last part of Dr. Mclatchie's article. Which is lizards with placentas. I brought that up as a really clear example of what is clearly an irreducibly complex trait evolving. And this example is interesting for what it is. The genetics and the molecular biology is really cool, but what's even more interesting is what Dr. Mclatchie's response reveals about creationism and their arguments. Because the argument Dr. Mclatchie makes here, make no mistake about it, makes his position untestable and unfalsifiable, and I want everyone to see exactly how and why that is. So I'm going to start by pointing out three places where we agree. I like to do this in my stuff when I'm talking about creationist arguments. I really like to start by just laying the groundwork of a bunch of things we agree on. So the first thing that we agree on here is species-level creation. In my original video, I said that creationists could deny that lizards have evolved placentas, which is to say they can deny that these structures appeared at some point between the past, whatever you want to put that, it's special creation or when lizards first appeared or whenever, right, and the present. And they could do that by invoking species-level creation, right, saying that every species of lizard was independently created, so the ones with placentas were created with placentas, right? And that's obviously silly. And my point there was to make an argument by contradiction. Creationists reject species-level creation, but also require it if they're going to say that these structures were created rather than evolved. And obviously, creationists reject species-level creation, the implication being that these structures clearly evolved. Now, Dr. Mclatchie wrote, ID, intelligent design, does not even necessarily commit one to a denial of common descent. The core claim of ID is more minimal than that, namely that undirected processes are inadequate to create complex, integrated systems. In other words, you don't have to invoke species-level creation to make the argument that these structures did not evolve through natural processes, right? Which, fine, fair enough, great. We all agree that nobody is invoking species-level creation. Awesome. We agree on that. That moves the ball forward. Now, the implication of that is the second thing that we all agree on, and by we, when I say we all agree, I mean myself and Dr. Mclatchie specifically, but also just like creationists kind of in general. The second thing that we all agree on here is that at some point in the past, lizards with placentas did not exist, and now they do. right? Lizard placentas had to come into existence at some point. But even creationists are not claiming that this occurred at creation in each species of lizard with placentas, because going back to point of agreement number 1, we agree that these lizards were not all independently created, right? So that's agreement number 2. Lizard placentas did not exist at some point in the past, and now they exist. And finally, our third point of agreement is that lizard placentas are irreducibly complex. Dr. Mاكlاتشي wrote, "Of his 4 examples, this one is, in my view, the most compelling example of a complex trait. As Stern Cardinal himself notes, however, this case is the only one of his examples that has not been directly observed." So, cool, he's not disputing the premise that this is an irreducibly complex trait. He's disagreeing with my argument by disputing the other component, that these placentas evolved through natural processes. But here's the thing I want everyone to see. In making this argument, Dr. Mاكlátchي totally steps in it. So follow me here as we go through this. When you really get down to it, we have 2 possible explanations for how this trait came to be. Either lizard placentas evolved through natural processes, or they appeared through some kind of supernatural intervention, whatever you want to call that, right? And the problem for Dr. Mاكlátchي here is that we agree that the structures appeared at some point in the past. They didn't exist, and now they do. Which means we have 2 options for that supernatural cause. Either you have divine intervention that caused them to appear kind of in real time, right? When they appeared, there was at that moment supernatural intervention that caused them to appear. Or you have some kind of design intervention on the front end that caused these structures to appear later on. Now that first option is obviously a non-starter, and everyone more or less agrees on that, right? I've had conversations with creationists, and several times I've said, I just want to be clear, you're not saying there's like ongoing God causing specific mutations to happen, right? And everyone's always like, yeah, we're not saying that's the case. We're not proposing that as an explanation. That's obviously not something anyone's proposing, because then we'd be talking about actual supernatural intervention in ongoing biological processes. And that's obviously untestable and unfalsifiable. It's just God could do it that way, or God could make it look that way. And if that's what's going on, then there's no way to evaluate if any specific biological change is the result of evolutionary processes or supernatural interference in those processes. And this is not kind of my wheelhouse, but I've read other people making the argument that such a position would also demote God to the role of divine genetic engineer, essentially. So for several reasons, that position is out, right? We're not saying that there's supernatural intervention on an ongoing basis to cause specific things to occur in biological systems in real time. Okay. So the alternative is the one that Dr. Mاكlátchي invokes in the article as the alternative to evolution as an explanation for lizards with placentas. In a word, front-loading. He wrote, "This leaves open the possibility of some sort of front-loaded design in the ancestral lizard." This is where I want to be super clear. That's not better, right? That explanation, in fact, has the exact same problems as ongoing supernatural interference in biological processes. It's untestable and unfalsifiable, and as we're about to see, requires the same level of interference. Because those novel placentas that we find in some lizard species but not others, those require different DNA sequences compared to not having placentas. And I want to just say at the front right here, if any creationist is going to say, well, they don't actually require different sequences, then like, fine, then nothing matters in biology, right? If you're going to say you can have egg-laying development and in utero gestation via a placenta development with the exact same nucleotide sequences, then nothing matters, and like, we're just playing Calvin ball at that point, okay? So I would like for everyone to just accept as granted these two different reproductive modes require different genome sequences. We should all be able to just agree on that at the front end. And if we can't, we've got bigger problems, okay? So granting that, you can't just claim that these genes were created at the front end and then switched on in some lizards, but not others, right? Because then the lizards, they would have the same genomes, and we see the placenta genes in the non-placental lizards. You need actual changes to the alleles themselves, or you need changes to the regulatory sequences that express different genes, right? So that even if those sequences are there and we just haven't figured it out for some reason, let's just say they're there and hidden in the genome or whatever, you're still going to have changes to the regulatory sequences that cause those placenta genes to be active in some lineages but not others. Whatever the case is, those changes are necessarily mutations, right? You're going to have common ancestors, because we're not denying common ancestry here. Some lineages are going to do one thing, some are going to do the other, and you need changes in the genome that underlie those differences. The word for those changes is mutation, and mutations are stochastic, which means you can't pre-program mutations to happen. Or you can say they were pre-programmed to happen, but then you're proposing supernatural intervention to cause specific mutations to happen in specific lineages in advance rather than in real time. The only difference between the front-loading and ongoing interference is when the manipulation occurs. Accepting either renders it equally impossible to distinguish between what you might call real mutations and supernaturally ordained mutations. And I know some creationists listening to this are already yelling at me, but what about epigenetics? And let me tell you, you're just moving the problem back a step. Because epigenetic regulation is ultimately governed by differences in genome sequence, just like the other stuff we've already talked about. So you're just moving the problem to a different part of the genome. This is all just God could have done it that way. If we accept this as the explanation, there are no rules, there are no observations that could preclude design, because God could cause specific changes to happen in biological systems right now in the present. There are no observations that could possibly falsify that possibility, whether you propose the intervention happens in real time or in the past via front-loading. In either case, you're still proposing supernatural manipulation of natural processes as your explanation. There's no way to test that. There's nothing that could falsify it. Even if I watch a new trait evolve in the lab and document the specific mutations that cause that trait to evolve, creationists could still say God could have made that happen. And that's not science. And that is the very explanation that Dr. Mاكlاتشي is proposing here. So thank you, Dr. Mاكlاتشي, for providing the opportunity to illustrate how scientifically hollow creationism is.